Picture this for a second. It's midnight in the royal palace. A father stands over his sleeping son's bed. The boy is just 16 years old, and in the father's hand is a dagger. What happens next is so shocking that when historians first discovered the evidence, they refused to believe it was real. The father drives the blade into his son's chest, his own flesh and blood. But here's the truly insane part. This wasn't some random act of madness. This was calculated, planned, and it was just the beginning. Because over the next 3 years, this man would systematically murder 27 members of his own family. Brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews, even his own mother. 27 people who shared his blood, all dead by his command. And the most disturbing detail? He did it all while throwing lavish parties, commissioning beautiful art, and being celebrated as one of the greatest rulers of his age. His subjects called him the Magnificent. History books praise his military genius and cultural achievements, but they don't tell you about the rooms in his palace that were permanently stained with his family's blood. They don't mention the screams that echoed through the halls at night, or the fact that by the time he was done, he was the only adult male left alive in his entire bloodline. This is King Murad III. He's one of the most successful Ottoman sultans in history, ruling an empire that stretched across 3 continents. He commanded armies of over 200,000 men while still in his 20s. He owned more gold than the entire treasuries of England and France combined, and boy did he enjoy that wealth. He had a harem of over 2,000 women and fathered 103 children. But how does a prince who started out writing poetry and studying philosophy end up becoming one of history's most prolific family killers? How do you go from composing love letters to ordering the strangulation of your own brothers? The truth behind this story is even crazier than you'd expect, because Murad didn't just kill his family out of paranoia or madness. He did it because of an ancient law that actually required him to commit these murders. A law that said the survival of the empire was more important than blood, more important than family, more important than basic human morality. Little did anyone know that this same law would eventually destroy the very empire it was meant to protect. You see, Murad realized something that would haunt rulers for centuries to come. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you should fear the most. Welcome to the insane true story of the king who killed his entire family to hold his throne. Murad was born in 1546 inches, the magnificent Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. From the moment he took his first breath, he was surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Silk sheets, golden cribs, an army of servants catering to his every need. But here's the crucial part that shaped everything that came later. Despite all this wealth and comfort, young Murad lived in constant, paralyzing fear. You see, in the Ottoman Empire, being born a prince wasn't the blessing you might think. It was more like a death sentence with a fancy title. The empire had something called the Law of Fratricide, a legal requirement that when a new sultan took the throne, he had to execute all his brothers to prevent civil war. Murad would later reflect on this and say it was like growing up in a golden cage where the other birds might kill you at any moment. When Murad was just 7 years old, he witnessed something that would scar him forever. His grandfather, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, had his own son, Murad's uncle, strangled to death in front of the entire court. The prince had been accused of plotting rebellion. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The message was clear. In this family, trust no one. It was an early lesson for young Murad that love and loyalty meant nothing when power was at stake. His mother, Safiye Sultan, would pull him aside after the execution and whisper something he'd never forget. "Remember, my son, in this palace, your brother's smile might hide a dagger. Your cousin's embrace might be planning your funeral. Trust only yourself." What's really interesting, though, is that Murad wasn't raised to be sultan at all. He was the second son, and his older brother Mehmed was the heir apparent. So while Mehmed was getting intensive military training and studying statecraft, Murad was left to pursue his own interests. He spent his days in the palace library, reading poetry and philosophy. He studied music and became quite talented at playing the oud. Servants who knew him then described him as gentle, thoughtful, even shy. One tutor wrote in his journal that Prince Murad has the soul of an artist, trapped in the body of a warrior dynasty. But you see, this artistic soul was also incredibly observant. While his brother was learning to fight battles, Murad was studying people. He watched how courtiers whispered in corners. He noticed which servants were loyal and which could be bought. He saw how his father, Sultan Selim II, used fear and favor to control the nobles. Murad must have thought that if he ever had to rule, he'd need more than swords and soldiers. He'd need to master the art of manipulation. Then, in 1574, everything changed. Mehmed died suddenly at age 21. The official cause was smallpox, but rumors swirled through the palace. Some whispered about poison. Others spoke of dark magic. The truth is, nobody really knows what killed the heir to the Ottoman throne. But what is clear is that overnight, Murad went from spare air writing poetry to crown prince of one of the world's most powerful empires. And that's when the gentle poet began his transformation into something much darker. Because now, suddenly, his 19 brothers weren't just siblings, they were threats. Each one had a legal claim to the throne. Each one had supporters among the nobles. Each one was, according to Ottoman law and tradition, supposed to die when Murad became sultan. The moment Murad became heir apparent, the entire dynamic of the palace shifted. But Murad saw an opportunity here that others had missed. Instead of immediately plotting against his brothers like everyone expected, he did something incredibly clever. He became their best friend. He started hosting elaborate parties in his quarters, inviting his brothers to feast and drink and enjoy themselves. He gave them expensive gifts, beautiful slaves, whatever they wanted. Using these new connections, he learned everything about them, their fears, their ambitions, their weaknesses. His brother Ahmed loved gambling. Murad made sure he always had money to bet. His brother Osman was paranoid about assassination. Murad assigned his own personal guards to protect him, guards who reported every conversation back to Murad. You see, while his brothers were enjoying the parties and gifts, Murad was building something much more valuable, a network of informants that reached into every corner of the palace. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. Every servant, every guard, every concubine became a potential spy. He didn't threaten them or bribe them with gold. Instead, he made them believe he was their friend, their protector, the prince who actually cared about their well-being. One kitchen slave later testified that Murad would come down to the servants' quarters at night, sit with them, ask about their families, their troubles. "He made us feel seen," she said. "In a palace where we were invisible, he saw us." But here's where it gets really clever. Murad started spreading different information to different brothers. He'd tell Ahmed that Osman was plotting against him. He'd whisper to Osman that Mehmed was gathering supporters. He'd warn Mehmed that Ahmed had hired assassins. None of it was true, but the paranoia was infectious. Soon, the brothers who had once played together as children were looking at each other with suspicion and fear. They stopped gathering together. They started keeping their own guards close. They began plotting, not against Murad, who seemed to be everyone's friend, but against each other. And all the while, Murad was watching, waiting, taking notes on who was truly dangerous and who was simply scared. In December 1574, Sultan Selim II died. Some say it was from a drunken fall in his bath. Others whisper that Murad might have arranged the accident. We'll never know for sure, but what happened next was documented in excruciating detail. The moment the Sultan's death was announced, Murad didn't rush to claim the throne. Instead, he waited exactly 3 hours. During those 3 hours, his most loyal servants, the ones he'd cultivated over months of late-night conversations, quietly locked every door in the prince's quarters. The brothers woke up to find themselves prisoners in their own rooms. Then, one by one, the executions began. But here's the crucial part that most historians miss. The killings weren't random or rage-fueled. Each death was specifically planned to send a message. The first to die was Ahmed, the gambler. He was strangled with a silk bowstring, the traditional method for executing royalty, while sitting at a card table mid-game. The message was clear: the game is over. Next was Osman, the paranoid one. He was killed by the very guards Murad had assigned to protect him. They held him down while the palace executioner did his work. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. His paranoia had been justified all along. What people didn't realize was that Murad had been planning these executions for months, maybe years. Each brother's death was choreographed like a scene in a play, designed for maximum psychological impact on those who remained. But Murad wasn't satisfied with just killing his brothers. He understood that each prince had supporters, allies, entire networks that could rise against him. So he expanded the purge. The brothers' sons, some as young as 5 years old, were strangled in their beds. Their mothers were either executed or sold into slavery. Even male servants who had been too close to the princes were eliminated. In total, that first night, 19 people died. And this is very different to how previous sultans had handled succession. Usually, the killing stopped with the brothers. But Murad realized something his predecessors hadn't. Leaving any male with royal blood alive was leaving a potential rallying point for rebellion. The scale of what happened next defies belief. Over the following months, Murad systematically eliminated every single male relative who could potentially challenge his rule. Cousins who lived in distant provinces, thinking they were safe, woke up to find Ottoman soldiers at their doors. Elderly uncles who had renounced any claim to power decades ago were dragged from their retirement estates and executed. He even had his father's brothers, men in their 60s and 70s, strangled in their sleep. The Ottoman Empire had seen fratricide before, but nothing like this. Previous sultans might kill 5 or 6 brothers. Murad killed 27 family members in his first year alone. But here's what's absolutely insane. While this systematic slaughter was happening, Murad was simultaneously hosting the most spectacular parties the empire had ever seen. Foreign ambassadors would attend lavish feasts where Murad would discuss poetry and philosophy, all while his relatives were being murdered in other wings of the same palace. Murad now had absolute power, and this is very different to European kings who had to deal with noble families and parliaments. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's word was literally law. If Murad said the sky was green, the sky was green. If he wanted someone dead, they were dead before sunset. He controlled an empire that stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the Caucasus. His armies numbered over 200,000 professional soldiers. His treasury contained wealth that European kings could only dream of. At the height of his power, Murad's daily breakfast cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. He had a different woman brought to his bed every night from his harem of 2,000. He commissioned artists to create miniature paintings of his conquests, each one more elaborate than the last. He built mosques and palaces that still stand today as monuments to his reign. The problem was, Murad had succeeded too well in his purge. By eliminating every potential threat, he'd also eliminated every potential successor, except his own sons. But the paranoia that had driven him to kill his brothers didn't disappear with their deaths. If anything, it got worse. Murad began to see threats everywhere. A servant who looked at him wrong might disappear. A noble who grew too wealthy would find himself accused of treason. Even his own mother wasn't safe from his suspicion. When she suggested he was being too harsh, he had her confined to a remote section of the palace, forbidden from seeing anyone without his permission. But the killings didn't stop there. You see, Murad had over 100 children from his many concubines, and he began to realize that these sons might one day do to each other what he had done to his brothers. Even worse, they might do it to him. The law of fratricide didn't just allow brothers to kill each other. In theory, it could justify a son overthrowing his father if he could claim the father was unfit to rule. Little did Murad know, but his eldest son, Prince Mehmed, had already started gathering supporters among the military. The prince had watched his father's rise to power and learned the lessons all too well. Secret meetings were held, alliances were formed, plans were made. However, back in the palace, people were starting to ask questions. Foreign ambassadors wrote concerned letters home about the Sultan's increasingly erratic behavior. He would fly into rages over minor slights. He ordered executions for crimes as small as spilling wine on a carpet. One particularly disturbing incident involved a cook who served a meal that was slightly cold. Murad had the man's hands cut off, then forced him to continue cooking for the palace with prosthetic attachments. The message was clear: failure, no matter how small, would not be tolerated. The Ottoman Empire might have been at its territorial peak, but internally it was rotting. The constant purges had eliminated not just threats, but also competent administrators and generals. Positions were filled based on loyalty to Murad, not ability. The quality of governance declined. Corruption spread like wildfire because officials knew they could be executed at any moment, so they stole what they could while they could. Then in January 1595, everything Murad had built came crashing down in the most unexpected way. But it wasn't rebellion or assassination that ended his reign. It was something far more mundane and perhaps more fitting. Murad died of a seizure, possibly brought on by years of paranoia, stress, and excessive indulgence. He was only 48 years old. The man who had survived countless real and imagined assassination attempts, who had killed dozens of family members to secure his throne, died alone in his bed, choking on his own tongue while his guards stood outside, too terrified to enter without permission. For Murad, as the consequences of his actions started to come out even in death, the real tragedy became apparent.